All right, I think now's a good time. Good morning again, everyone. My name is Ned Hallaby. I'm the Director of Sales for our product claims vertical here at SCS. That vertical encompasses non-GMO project, USDA organic, gluten-free, and most importantly for today, the RSPO supply chain certification worldwide. I would like to welcome you to this webinar titled Sustainable Palm Oil Practices, Overview of RSPO Supply Chain Certification. I'll be introducing the webinar in the first couple of slides, and then I'm going to be passing it over to Amanda Castelda, who is our Senior Technical Specialist for RSPO Supply Chain, as well as an auditor. Amanda, why don't you take a moment to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for being here. I'm excited to give you this quick overview today. So as Ned mentioned, I'm the Senior Technical Specialist, and I'm also Regional Manager for North America, Europe, and Australia. Within my role, I focus a lot on the technical side of auditing and, of course, supporting with the standard. So that's why I'm here with you today, hopefully to help you understand a bit about the certification process.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Amanda. Why don't we go to the next slide? So here's an overview of what we're going to be covering today. We're going to start out with some general information about SCS Global Services for anyone who isn't aware of what we do and who we are. Then we're going to cover a broad overview of the RSPO supply chain certification service. And so this webinar is going to be focused on that supply chain audit as opposed to the plantation level audit that happens. So if that's your core level of interest, we are going to be covering, supply chain for global operations, and these are designed to be, things that are applicable to these supply chain actors throughout the world. And then, Amanda will cover the certification process in its entirety from the beginning of the scoping stage, as we do here when people initially inquire, all the way through the certification decision and the steps in between. And then we'll cover some FAQs at the end. And as I mentioned previously, there will be a live Q&A portion. So please use that question box in the GoToWebinar interface to post your questions, and we'll absolutely get to them at the end. So SCS, what is SCS? SCS, broadly speaking, is a certification body. And what that means is we are accredited to offer dozens of certifications in a whole host of industries around the world. And our general focus is in the sustainability space, but we have many services that are applicable to companies that are producing products, to brand owners, to distributors and supply chain actors throughout the world. And that encompasses 30,000 certifications in 125 countries, 15,000 clients in terms of corporations, governments, NGOs, and everything in between. We've been around for 40 years, so we have many decades of experience in the certification space. And it's in our name. We are a global company. We have auditing capabilities or offices or satellites throughout the world in virtually every corner that you can think of, to meet the needs of our clients, whether that's in forestry or food or materials development. There's really, there are few places, where sustainability is being applied that we're not able to offer at least some level of service. And, we work across a lot of different industries, as I mentioned, but within the general food space, SCS is highly accredited to many different schemes throughout the sustainability space, through the food safety space, certainly, and then what we call product claims, which, as I mentioned, is non-GMO project, USDA organic, logos that you're going to really find on food products themselves, indicating the sustainability. So if you have questions about any of those services, I will do my best to answer them after the webinar. Please get in touch with us if you have questions about food safety or sustainable agriculture, or really however you are planning to sort of address the needs of your company, whether it's a marketing effort or meeting the needs of your buyers. SCS probably has a solution, or can at least point you in the right direction to find what you're looking for. So we really are a comprehensive certification company, and I can do my best to point you in the right direction if I can't answer your question directly. And with that, I'm gonna pass it over to Amanda. She's the expert, and she will be able to take you through the rest of the webinar, and I will check back in during the live Q&A. So again, there is a question and answer box. Please don't hesitate to put questions in there.
Great, thanks, Ned. So we're going to just start with a very brief overview of RSPO for those of you that may not be too familiar with RSPO. We're not going to dig very deep into it, but just give you an idea of the organization. So first off, RSPO stands for the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. It's strictly focused on palm oil. RSPO is a nonprofit organization, and it brings together stakeholders from 7 different sectors in the palm oil industry. So this can include stakeholders such as retailers, consumer product manufacturers, and of course growers and palm oil producers, as well as NGOs. So RSPO has developed a set of environmental and social criteria that companies must meet to produce and sell certified sustainable palm oil products. And it can vary depending on the part of the supply chain that you're in. I'll briefly talk about that in the upcoming slides. So RSPO can be implemented through certification via either principles and criteria and or supply chain certification. So although today we're solely focused on supply chain, I just want to briefly mention what principles and criteria is for those that may not be familiar. So pretty much when you think of P&C, think of the plantation side and the mill side. So RSPO has criteria that allows palm oil growers as well as mills to demonstrate compliance to the highest standards. And this helps with social and environmental requirements. So the scheme itself for RSPO has strict criteria that limits deforestation. It incorporates concepts such as high conservation value analysis, high carbon stock assessments, but also it has a social aspect with the inclusion of decent living wage for workers. So if you think of plantations for palm oil, they're usually in the equatorial countries, most of which may be third world. So it's very important for this certification to help these countries and these workers live a fair, decent life. So on the supply chain side, which again is what we're focusing on today, this is more of the traceability certification part where you're talking about actual goods that are being manufactured and sold. So most supply chain certification would be consumer products manufacturers, distributors. There's a whole gamut of different product categories. But just so you know, the supply chain certification standard is for consumers and users of palm oil globally to ensure that the claims they're receiving can reliably be linked back to the sustainable production practices. So if you think of the supply chain, think of a chain of custody. When you purchase a certified product, you should be able to see the traceability of that product when it comes to the sustainability. So certified companies to the supply chain certification standard, they can make traceability claims according to 3 different supply chain models. There's mass balance, segregated, and identity preserved. We're not going to go into the details of what those supply chain models mean, but it's just different levels of traceability. But overall, using these supply chains increases the strength of the chain of custody claims that we make. So the purpose of today is to go over the certification process here at SCS to give you an idea of how the actual flow works from the very beginning to the point of certification. So again, this is specific to supply chain. P&C has a very different process flow, but at the very basic level, it would be somewhat similar. So overall, the certification process for supply chain could take 12 to 16 weeks from the date that you sign your work order and professional services agreement. Now, this time frame can change depending on a few different factors. So for example, the timely submission of documentation. So there's an application process. Obviously, there's the quoting process and the work order and the professional services agreement. So depending how quickly those pieces of information are provided, it kind of moves things along. And then once that type of information is signed and ready to go, then you really get into the preparedness of the facility, or if there are multiple facilities, how prepared are they for an audit? Are they just ready to go, or do they possibly need more time to get their documentation ready? We'll talk about some of the documentation that would be required. I know sometimes people come into certification not understanding that it's an audit that looks at procedures, training, records. It's not just a certification that's granted without that type of information. So obviously availability for the inspections themselves, is there flexibility with timing? Where are the auditors located in comparison to the locations being audited? Does the client have blackout dates, things like that. And then lastly, once you complete your audit, if any nonconformities are issued, obviously you need some time to close out those nonconformities. So for an evaluation audit, you do have 3 months to close those out. So if the company needs the full 3 months, then obviously we're going to have to add that time to the time span we just mentioned. If they close them out quickly, then it's a quicker process. But certification cannot be granted until all nonconformances are closed. So obviously we will work with participants to reduce any delays and provide feedback as quickly as possible. That's something we do pride ourselves on here at SCS, is we're pretty communicative and provide feedback pretty quickly. So this is what the process flow would look like. And then the following slides, we're actually going to also talk about these in a little more detail. But just quickly to go over the process flow, you start with a scoping process that could take maybe 1 to 5 days. This is where your application comes in, scoping, quoting, signing of the work order, and the professional services agreement. Again, we're going to go through this in a little more detail in the following slides. Then we move to onboarding, which could take 1 to 2 weeks, depending again on how quickly documentation and communication is taking place. This is where the sales team, like Ned and his team, will introduce the client to the actual technical team and the operations team that you would be working with. This is also where someone in my role, particularly myself, would step in and work with you to answer any questions you have and just to support you along the process. And I would also be assigning your auditor, and just helping move along the initial phase of the project. Then you move into your actual audit. Again, we'll talk about this in more detail. So the audit phase could take 2 to 8 weeks. This just depends on, how prepared is your company, how much time do you need? Do you need an audit further out or much quicker? It just really depends. Then you move into the certification decision after you've completed your audit. Again, we'll go through this in a little more detail here in the following slides, but pretty much that's a finalization of your audit report, closure of nonconformances, technical review, submitting it to RSPO for final approval. And then RSPO supply chain is a 5-year certification period, but you do have to complete an annual surveillance audit to maintain that certification and the annual license with RSPO. So this last section is specific to that annual surveillance audit, and we'll go through that. So in the scoping phase, this is where everything begins. So you've reached out to SCS, you're interested in learning more about the certification process, or maybe you already know what it is and you know that you want to move forward. So everything begins with an application, because in this application, you'll discuss what kind of products you're going to be producing, what kind of company you are. As it says here on the screen, you mentioned products, ingredients, and also your production process. So are you actually baking cookies and cakes, or are you actually developing chemicals? Or maybe you're a distributor where you're bringing something in and just selling it right back out. So this is the type of information that would be in the application. We would also need to know how many facilities are in scope, so we can determine if it's a single site certificate or multi-site certificate. We would discuss the level of readiness so we can help you with the most convenient schedule possible with our auditors. This is also where you would confirm the supply chain module. So earlier I mentioned mass balance, segregated, identity preserved. You would select one or all three or two, but you must select at least one because your supply chain will determine the path of your procedures and of course your production processes or whatever process it is that you fall under. So we would have that conversation with you if you're unsure, but in the end, it will all be in the application. And then from there, I would work with sales to confirm the scope. That way they can issue you a quote based on what's applicable. You'll receive the quote. And then if it's accepted, that turns it into what we call a work order. You would sign the work order and the professional service agreement and submit it back to SES. And that initiates the entire project. And then from there, we move to onboarding. This is, like I mentioned earlier, where Ned and his team would initiate the communication between the client and the operations and technical team. So this is where, for example, Ned will formally introduce you to me, our coordinator, our operations manager, our program manager, and you'll have our contact information. And that's like the green light stating this project is good to go. Let's move forward. And then you'll hear from me just to confirm that, you know, if you need support, I'm here. I'll set up a meeting with you if you're interested in doing the Q&A or reviewing anything that you might have doubts about. And then during this part of the process, I'm in the background already assigning auditors, figuring out who's closest to your locations, you know, what makes the most sense for your timing, that kind of thing. And then you'll hear from the auditor towards the end of this part of the process. So the key components of the audit. So we move from onboarding to you've now heard from your auditor, you've scheduled an audit date, and now we're into the audit phase. So the actual inspection process is designed to ensure that everything adheres to the RSPO supply chain standard, as well as the market communications and claims standards. So those are two of the main standards within the supply chain certification. We're not going to go through those in a technical way today, but just at the very basic level, the supply chain certification standard is focused on anything procedural and anything that would have a record attached to it. And then the market communications and claims standard focuses on the passing of RSPO claims, as well as using any of the RSPO trademarks or labels. So anyway, the key components of an audit, you'll see here laid out here in this little flow. You begin with an opening meeting. The auditor comes in and just goes over with you, obviously introductions, that kind of thing. But most importantly, they'll go over the scope of the audit with you and the criteria to make sure everybody's on the same page and that we've captured the correct scope. For example, your supply chain module, your business type, you know, are you a baker or are you a chemical manufacturer? There's a huge difference, and your audit path will take you in a different way depending on that category. They'll review your itinerary for the day, confidentiality, so on and so forth. And then once you get into what I call the meat of the audit, you start with documentation review. This is where the auditor goes through all of the procedures that you've created for your RSPO program. RSPO has some very specific requirements that, let's say you are SQF certified or you have some other kind of food safety certification, so you probably already have a robust program in place. You may just need to tweak it a little bit to cover the additional requirements that RSPO has. And so when your auditor is reviewing your documentation, they'll be making sure that you're addressing the RSPO requirements. There is a facility walkthrough. During the walkthrough here, the auditor will take a site tour understanding what I like to say, a day in the life of your product. Whatever that product is, when you purchase a certified ingredient, what are you doing with it? And what does it turn into? What are you doing with it at the end? So that's what they're wanting to see during the facility walkthrough. And of course, there's some records review during the site tour. For example, receiving and sales documentation, shipping labels, things like that. And during the documentation portion, as well as the site visit, there will be interviews that occur with critical control points throughout the process. So for example, purchasing contacts, if you have a trademark person that does trademarks, shipping and receiving, things like that. And then after you get through that part of the audit, then you'll wrap it up for the day. The auditor will do a formal closing meeting in which he or she will sum up the day, bring up any nonconformities or observations, which by that point you would already know, you'd already have a good idea of what to expect. But they would go over that information with you, and of course they'd go over next steps and to help you just understand the expectations of what's to come. So sometimes there is that preparation piece that's needed, just depends on how the audit goes. So after the audit is complete, your auditor will write up the report. Again, your certification can't be granted until your nonconformities are fully closed. So 1 week from the closure of all of your nonconformities, or if you don't have nonconformities, 1 week from the end of your audit, they will submit the report to the SCS technical team. The technical team will take some days to review it, make sure everything has been addressed and everything makes sense. And then the technical reviewer buttons everything up, creates a certificate, confirms if the certification is being granted from the SCS side of things. And then they'll issue the entire audit package to RSPO via the RSPO system. And then RSPO does a final review of the audit, the certificate, all the information that was just collected. And then they grant the final approval, and then they list the company on the RSPO website. So there's kind of like a two-part piece here. First, you get your initial certification decision from SCS saying, yes, you're good to go. Now we're submitting to RSPO for the final approval. And then once RSPO approves it, that's when you officially get listed on the website and you're fully officially certified. So I do want to mention here, I have PalmTrace and Prisma. Some of you may have heard there's a new platform coming out in January called Prisma. It's going to replace the PalmTrace system. So right now, PalmTrace is used for this entire submission process for the annual RSPO license. You even use PalmTrace for the purchasing of credits and things like that. This is all going to transfer to Prisma in January. So you'll receive information from RSPO and lots of training on how to use that program. So if you're currently familiar with PalmTrace, just keep in mind it's changing to Prisma. So after the certification decision is done, for your evaluation audit, then you move into what's called the surveillance audit. So like I mentioned earlier, it is a 5-year certification period, but you do have to complete an annual surveillance audit to maintain your certification and the annual license that RSPO issues. So you would hear from SCS 6 to 8 months prior to that annual expiration. And then that's when we start the process again with the work order, the PSA, just confirming the scope, nothing has changed, that kind of thing. And then that way we can get your audit scheduled in sufficient time before your annual expiration. So I want to go over a few frequently asked questions. It's just a few, and then I'll hand it over to Ned and we'll do a live Q&A. So one question we get often is, especially from new participants in certification, is what exactly does a documentation review cover? Again, this is a supply chain audit. So you'll see a list of documents here. Some of these may not apply to you. For example, outsourcing. If you're not using outsourcing or subcontractor, that wouldn't apply. But just to give you an idea, since this is a supply chain, aka chain of custody audit, we're coming in to see that you have procedures covering your entire process from the very beginning with sourcing and purchasing all the way through the end where you're actually selling the product and keeping up with the inventory or the outputs that you sold. So this documentation review would include things like purchasing and incoming goods. So not only the process itself, but the documentation that you would receive from your suppliers, for example, like a BOL or a certificate of analysis. It just depends on what they provide. And then of course we have the sales side and outgoing. So what do you issue to your customer when you pass an RSPO claim? How do you keep up with the volumes of outputs? That kind of thing. Volume tracking in the ERP system. We'll want to see how you track the volumes. RSPO requires an aggregated annual summary of your volumes for RSPO. And so we'll want to get that information. Obviously, when you're newly certified, you're not going to have that, but you should be able to explain how you can track that information. And then your ERP system, whether you use SAP or a manual process, whatever it is, you'll demonstrate that to the auditor so they can see that you're well prepared to track all that's needed. Like many other certification programs, there's a training requirement, internal auditing requirement, management review requirement. So for an evaluation audit, we will expect to see that training has been completed for the new program and that you have records for it. Now, internal auditing and management review, since you're new to the certificate, you may not have these two already completed for RSPO, but we would at least need to see the procedures for this and how you're including it within your normal practice and what kind of records you're going to be keeping. Do you have a mock internal audit checklist? That kind of thing. If you do plan to use trademarks, you'll have that discussion. You'll show procedures, maybe even examples. If you're going to pass the RSPO claim, which for example is maybe stating RSPO mass balance on an outgoing BOL, you'll have that conversation with the auditor. If you're going to use outsourcing, there's a section in the standard that covers that. So we'll be looking to see that you've covered all the necessary requirements. There's handling of complaints, non-conforming products. There's a supplier verification requirement that's required monthly. So we'll be looking at that. And then of course, how you will manage the supply chain model, whether it's one or all three of these. And just so you know, these are the abbreviations for identity, preserved, segregated, and mass balance. So in addition to the documentation review, we do get asked a lot, what else do you look at? So pretty much, if you think of the facility tour, which I talked about a few minutes ago, we want to see how your product moves through the facility. So once you receive it, where does it go? What do you do with it? How does it go back out the door? In what form? That includes interviews. It includes a review of records while they're out there. Maybe they'll look at your inventory levels compared to what's in your ERP. I do want to mention also, if you happen to be a chemical manufacturer and you fall into the oleochemicals manufacturing category, this does include an additional part of the audit, which is called NX6, which has some very specific requirements related to conversion and formulas and things like that. So if you are an oleochemical manufacturer, you'll have this additional section. So you might have a little bit more documentation to provide. Just a note, your RSPO membership must be established before your audit. If you go into an audit without a membership, that's an automatic non-conformance and you cannot become certified without the membership. And the same for palm trace. You should have a palm trace identification, in the near future. That's going to change to a Prisma identification, but it's the same concept. So just keep that in mind before you go full steam ahead with an audit. Make sure you have these two set up. So I won't really read through this because I've kind of mentioned it, but pretty much everybody has to be an RSPO member if you want to be certified. If you want to be certified, you absolutely have a palm trace account as well. But not all RSPO members have to have a palm trace identification. If you want to be certified, yes, you have to have both. If you want to just be an RSPO member without certification, that's perfectly fine. You don't need palm trace unless you want to buy book and claim credits, for example. But I'm not going to go into technical detail about these two. I just want to mention there are guidance documents for these. And again, palm trace is changing to Prisma in just a couple months. So if you were to go on the RSPO website, rspo.org, along the top ribbon, there's a resource page. You click on that resource and there's lots of documentation that RSPO has provided. So I just want to confirm, if you're unsure of where to go, you can come to SCS to kind of guide you, or you can go to the resource page and you can find the standards there. You can find a checklist created by RSPO in the resource page as well. You can even find a volume summary template. Just a note, with the Prisma change, this template is changing as well. But once it changes and RSPO publishes it, it should be there already, actually. You'll see it on the resource page. And then don't forget the trademark standard. It's a separate standard from supply chain, so sometimes people forget that that's also part of the process. But that's an example of something you can find there as well. So I'm going to hand it back over to Ned just to cover this one slide, and then he'll kick off the Q&A.
Amazing. Thanks, Amanda. So why choose SCS Global Services? And the SCS RSPO team consists of multiple subject matter experts in both RSPO principles and criteria, that's the plantation level certification, as well as the RSPO supply chain certification. And really how we try to differentiate ourselves is through a couple of ways. And the first and most important of which is customer service and the speed in which we're able to audit our companies. So that's something we'll probably talk a little bit more about during the Q&A section, but we do pride ourselves on the speed in which we're able to respond to our clients as they are going through the audit process. So there's going to be inevitably a lot of back and forth when it comes to talking about what are the documentation needs and what is important, what's not important. The process steps will be articulated to you in a way that is clear, concise, and technically accurate. So those are the things that we're trying to do to get people through the process as quickly as possible and with as few headaches as any kind of audit could have. So those are the things that we're trying to do. Beyond that, we can bundle your audit with other certifications, certainly in terms of pricing, discounts. You'll receive discounts on your RSPO audit if you already do one of the other services that SCS offers. And then if you start with RSPO and you want to expand that work with SCS into food safety or other sustainability claims, certainly organic and non-GMO projects, as we mentioned before, those are kinds of things where you would be able to work with one company for multiple services, maybe not with the same auditor per se, as cross-training auditors is not always possible, but you will have one company to work with, discounted pricing, and the same level of customer service and speed that we have in our RSPO program. We extend to everything else. We are, on every sort of event and stakeholder we are participating in the RSPO world. So we are constantly keeping ourselves abreast of every development within the standard and where the auditing and certification of this very important program is heading. And so we are constantly educating ourselves and participating in that process with RSPO as a stakeholder. So those are some of the most important reasons why we feel we are at the tip of the spear when it comes to RSPO and all of these other certification programs as well. So that's SCS. If you have any other questions about it, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can put them into the box here. We're about to start the live Q&A section, but beyond that, once we wrap things up, we'll again have a survey. Please don't hesitate to fill out any survey that we're going to send you, because it does help us build better webinars and creating a more informed audience as well. So with that, let's do the Q&A. How about that, Amanda?
All right, sounds good.
So the first question we have, some of these questions have been answered during the webinar, but we are just going to sort of, re-engage on them. When will we be audited to the new standard?
The new standard. I'm not quite sure which new standard you're referencing. Principles and criteria is going through a revision phase right now. So for supply chain, that wouldn't apply to us. But as of right now, the two current standards for supply chain are the most current. In 2025, the supply chain standard will go through a revision process, but we don't have any timing from RSPO on that. So if you want to clarify what you mean by new standard, I'm happy to help.
Yeah, there are some questions sort of around a new standard, and that's not necessarily the case in the near term, as Amanda mentioned, but please let us know if you have any additional clarification or however you could sort of expand on that question, and we can answer that one in time. So another question we had is, how long does the certificate last?
So the certificate, when it's granted, it's for a 5-year period, but that's contingent upon you successfully completing the annual surveillance audits. So each year you'll be audited again.
Okay, great. And how long, generally speaking, does it take to get certified from the initial scoping phase through the issuance of the certificate?
So it could take 12 to 16 weeks from the, did you say from the initial part, like work order?
Yeah.
Yeah, it could take 12 to 16 weeks, depending how quickly we get documentation and how quickly we can get the audit scheduled.
Okay. Is it possible to create a view to check the supplier RSPO certification on a monthly basis as a list versus having to check the suppliers one by one?
So there is a function in Palm Trace currently that allows you to do that. I honestly don't know if they'll have that function in Prisma. I would think so, because Prisma is going to be much more user friendly. But as of today, you could go into Palm Trace and do that, and there is a guidance document on how to do that.
Great. For certificates or projects with multiple sites, do all the sites need to get audited every year?
So it really depends on the number of sites. If you only have 2 or 3 in the certificate, they'll more than likely all be audited every year. If you have 3 or more, there's a sample formula that RSPO has that we would calculate to determine which sites get audited every year. But most definitely the central office of the certificate would get audited every year, and then we'd use the sample formula to go from there.
Do you know what the sample formula is off the top of your head?
Yes, maybe. It's like points. It's the total number of participating sites times 0.6, the square root of that, plus the central office. For a surveillance, for a recertification, that moves from 0.6 to 0.8.
Is there an audit checklist on the website? I'm assuming they mean the RSPO website or maybe our website. Maybe you can answer both.
On the RSPO resource page, they have all the checklists that they've created as a template, including the recently published new audit checklist that they're requiring CBs to use. So it's all available on the RSPO website.
Okay, so yes, it is available on the RSPO website. Thank you. If I need to change something about my certification after becoming certified, what are the steps and does it cost more?
So first you'd reach out to SCS and tell us what kind of changes you're making. If it's simply a contact update, that's something we can take care of quickly. If it's something related to the actual scope, like maybe you've decided to produce something that originally wasn't audited, or you want to add a location, then that would be considered a scope change. And depending on where you are in your audit cycle, it could potentially require an additional audit to scope them in. Or if you're already due for your annual audit, we could do it simultaneously with the annual audit. So it just depends in terms of cost, is when during the year you're making a change and if that change requires a scope change.
Amazing. What buyers or retailers are requesting RSPO supply chain certification?
Right off the top of my head, retailers like Aldi, Walmart, Target, all the big names. Some of them don't require you pass the claim, but they require proof that you are certified. So I know those have been the biggest influencers in terms of consumer goods.
Awesome, thank you. Does the certifying body handle RSPO membership applications and membership fees?
No, the certifying body solely handles the certification. Your RSPO membership and your Prisma, currently Palm Trace, those IDs you would work directly with RSPO on.
Okay. Another comment is we are currently working on RSPO 2020 certification standard. This was being updated. Is there an update to the 2020 standard?
No, not yet. It should be next year. They'll start the process.
Okay, so it sounds like a 2025 thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So someone's asking for the link to the RSPO checklist. I think we can email you directly about that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if there are any other questions, please, now is the time. We are about 45 minutes into the webinar, and we are about to wrap things up. So I'll leave about 30 more seconds for anybody to post a question, and after that, we'll wrap up.
Looks like someone asked if the presentation will be available. Yes, it will be emailed tomorrow. Is that right, Ned?
Yeah, you will automatically receive an email with a link to the recorded version of the webinar tomorrow. So please look out. There will be some automated emails that go out. I'm sure that myself or one of my colleagues will reach out to everyone directly to see if there's any additional questions. If anybody wants to apply for RSPO certification, we are happy to send you an application form and give you a free quote. There's no commitment or anything else necessary to receive a free price quote. A meeting with myself, obviously, at any time to discuss the process in more detail and to provide any more information that we haven't on this webinar. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My email address is on the screen right now. And again, we will reach out to everybody with an email, probably a couple of different touch points over the next week or so. So, there will be adequate time to answer anything that we couldn't on this call. But I don't see any more questions, and I think we had a nice few minutes of Q&A. So on behalf of myself, Amanda, and SCS Global Services, thank you so much for attending this webinar today. We are available, anytime to help in any way that we can with RSPO and beyond. So thank you all again for attending.